I am honored to introduce my colleague, Johan, who also works at UNL. He'll be talking about his work coloring the relationship of frames and responses in teacher noticing.
Thank you. All right, so welcome to my first ever room talk. So I'm kind of nervous. So it's either I'm going to talk too much and go over time, or talk too fast and go under time. But either way, we'll have some time in the end for questions. Here's the outline of my talk. You might not be able to see it, but I did underline a few keywords in the title. So I want to talk about coloring, frames, responses, and noticing, and hopefully get us all on the same page with what I mean by those words. So this isn't like the typical way you start an empirical talk, but I think knowing that the data that I'm talking about here stems from my dissertation study of looking at first-time graduate student instructors, their first-time teaching content, will help frame, pun intended, the discussions that I have today. Some of them will seem like, isn't this more of like a preliminary report? You're not like giving me a concrete finding, but that's because I'm giving you a sneak peek of what my dissertation is about. So the questions in this interview ranged about their experiences as students. Like, what did you experience as a student, and how is that relating to what you're gonna do in the classroom as a future instructor? And so when I was reading these responses, I noticed that I was starting to understand the relationship between frames and noticing a lot more, and I thought that that's what I'm gonna report on today. But before I get into much of like the whole thing, I do want to clarify what I mean by coloring here. So there's this gray area between deficit versus anti-deficit noticing. And so the work that I'm doing today kind of gives more understanding within that gray area. So in like a poetic sense, I was like, oh, I'm adding more understanding to a gray area, therefore I'm coloring. So unfortunately, this isn't like graph theoretic coloring. This isn't like some other type of coloring. This is more so like an artistic choice. I've been told that maybe shading in the gray area might have been like a better title, but I'm kind of stuck with coloring, and I like it. All right, so let's get started with some theoretical perspectives that I have. The first is this concept of teacher noticing, or noticing for short. And I'm following the conceptualizations that Jacobs and colleagues put together, where for someone to notice, they have to first attend to the situation. And we might attend to nonverbal things like looks of confusion or like a raised hand, but you can also attend to verbal things like what are they saying during group work? Are they using the right terminologies? Are they using the right languages that you're expecting them to in a math classroom? It's about identifying what is important in the classroom and the whole hubbub of it, and then interpret and respond or what you expect them to be. You interpret or understand what you just attended to, what you just identified as important, and then now you'll respond to it either to the individual or to the classroom at large. Now, adding a layer of complexity to this, another perspective that I have is that the way someone frames teaching and learning shapes how they notice classroom events. So this is coming from Louis, Adiraja, and Jessup, and also Shiner. But for Louis, Adiraja, and Jessup, they call it the FAIR framework, building on the AIR framework from the last slide. And so I want to like talk about this today. All of these are supposed to be interacting with each other, so the frame interacts with all attend, interpret, and respond, and vice versa. But for today, I'm mostly going to talk about the direction of going from frames to the way that people respond. Right, so a theoretical background. I've been kind of like dropping this frames word at you without really talking about what I mean by that. So this is, the way I think about it is sort of like the filter, the structure, the idea that's in your head that lets you know, am I acting properly? Is the knowledge that I have currently relevant or valuable to the situation? And what interactions do I have and the other people around me have a right to engage in? And so this is coming from Greeno's 3 sort of like subdivisions of what frames afford participants. My favorite example to say to people who aren't like education heavy, so just consider the example of a person having a frame for when they're at a kitchen table versus where they're in a classroom. A typical kitchen table, you don't have to raise your hand to ask for ketchup or like to pass the salt. But in a classroom, for somebody to get attention, it's usually like a raised hand. But here's some more like actual classroom examples for what a frame of learning and teaching is. All right, something that Louis, Adirasia, and Jessup expand on is the way that one frames students, frames their teaching, frames mathematics as a subject, can have consequences towards deficit or anti-deficit ways of noticing. And to illustrate this, they focus on a very bad case scenario. If someone frames mathematics in a deficit way, then it'll make sense for us to assume that they'll also respond, attend, and interpret in a deficit way too. And they use this very sharp contrast between what a deficit case would look like and an anti-deficit case would look like to really get this consequence like set in stone of just like showing how quote unquote bad it is, how different the situations are. But in their discussion, they admit that there is this gray area between anti-deficit and deficit noticing. And so what I'm looking for today, what I'm going to report on today, are sort of the colors that I'm finding within that gray area, at least again, from the direction of frames to responding. All right, so here are my research questions for this talk. So the first one is just the motivation for how this study even came about. I just wanted to talk to graduate student instructors. What are they talking about when we talk about the ways that they want to teach or the things that they experience? So I just wanted to get like a catalog of how they discuss student learning and how their desired teaching practices are. And then the second question really gets at this coloring the gray area part. And again, these questions, these discussions that I had in the first research question are ultimately what lets me color this gray area that we have between anti-deficit and deficit ways of noticing. And again, just to remind you, because it's been a while since I started off with it, I interviewed 4 graduate students, and the questions that I asked kind of are motivated by these 3 points. So their experiences as students in the past that proved to be difficult. The main motivation for that is if they're recalling something is difficult, they might try their best to remedy that situation for their future students. So it lets me know what are the teaching practices that they don't want to repeat so they don't confuse their students, or what are the teaching practices that they want to do in order for students to not get confused. Their thoughts on how students learn math, that's really getting at the how are you framing learning in the classroom, and what a skillful teacher does. This is just sort of a proxy, because they haven't taught yet. This was, I don't know if I said that. This was right before their orientation for teaching. So they've never taught content before. And so I don't have a way to like see how they'll respond to a situation. This is sort of just a proxy. But as a side note, my dissertation does get to explore did what they say in the pre-interview actually surface within the classroom? Are they responding in the ways that they desired pre-semester? Okay, so I have all these interviews. What the heck do I do with it? After each interview, I went through all the questions and I gave a summary for each of them, what stood out to me, what is kind of like jumping out at me that I can ask later on or pay attention to in the observations. In the next round, I focused on each person and I highlighted discussions of teaching and learning using these 2 guided questions, like what are some aspects of teaching that this person is citing as a good, skillful, or maybe bad or undesired, and then what attitudes does this person have towards student learning? So this is really about teaching, and then this is about learning. And then I compared these frames and responses to Louis, Adirasia, and Jessup's models of purely deficit or purely anti-deficit, just to get a gauge of how are they comparing into that binary black and white. And then lastly, I looked for common threads among the participants or unique threads. Okay, so this is a really big table. I don't need you to read all of it, but this is about my dissertation. So what are the concerns that I have as a fellow graduate student instructor is that if I read somebody's like ways of talking, I might like project, oh, you're like doing this framing, but in reality, I'm just projecting the ways that I framed my own teaching and my own learning. And so I really wanted to get specific. I wanted to get very scientific in terms of like, what is a frame? And so on the left side, we have Reno's 3 things that I mentioned before. And so what I did for this table is I mapped it in the context of teaching and mapped it in the context of learning. I'm not going to delve too much into why the last row is combined, but I just sort of want to get this on your mind so you understand like how I viewed or how I understood people's frames. So if people talk to me about what their role is in the classroom or what knowledge is relevant for them to teach, that was me saying, oh, I can completely say that that is informing their frame of teaching. All right, so let's get into some findings. So the first one is about student learning. So in the responses to questions like, in your view, how do students learn math? There's a common thread among all 4 graduate students in framing learning as you have to do it. You have, like, there's no way around it. You have to do the problems. You have to do it to learn. And also highlighting the importance of student-to-student interactions. Just like how Longboat says it here. He says exploring, trying things out, and more importantly, discussing it with people behind you or like near you. And so what I want to go through now is just sort of the rest of the GSIs and highlight 1 or 2 things that stood out to me in relation to student learning. We have Paul here. He's talking about, again, the doing it yourself. That even if you're working on it with other people, there's still that component of you not just sitting idly by and listening in. You have to actually physically write it yourself. Then there's also this importance to them that I need to see how it connects to the other stuff that I care about in order for me to like actually learn math. For Andy, I wanted to highlight the discussions on the way that you learn math changes as you progress. So they had this distinction between high school and early college math. It's more of like just learning how to read math, how to speak the language of mathematics. But for proof math, they saw it as more being social. People have a preference of what type of proofs are beautiful to them, what they like to do, what they prefer. And so when you work together on proofs classes, it's more of a social event. You're discussing things. As opposed to like early college math, to them it was more so like you just gotta do the problems, do it rote, like just do the problems. And then lastly, for Carlos, the thing that I liked, or like that was a highlight for me was that they were the only one that specifically said, I'm gonna answer this question with how I like to learn as a student. And I think this is sort of getting at one of the motivations I have for this study, or for my dissertation, in that being a graduate student instructor in math means that you're not just a new instructor. There was something beforehand. I don't know if I can reference Kelsey's work because some of you weren't here, but she talks about this idea of continuity, where an instructor doesn't come into the role of, a graduate student instructor doesn't come into the role of instructor as an empty sheet. They've had experiences as a student, and this is informing them. And so what I'm highlighting for Carlos here is that the way that they frame learning math is informed by how they themselves learn math. And I feel, and I'm making the assumption that all the other instructors, all the other participants were also getting informed by this, but they just didn't speak to it as bluntly as Carlos did. So before I move on to the other findings here, we just saw the GSIs talk about how students might learn math. And in that path, I also asked them questions about where the instructor fits into all that. For the most part, they all talked about the instructor being the one to give the big picture, the concept, and to steer students in the right directions when doing problems together. In these next findings, I want to focus on 3 themes that came up among all 4 GSIs, or graduate student instructors, that are about desired teaching practices. And again, these are like sort of a proxy for how they might respond in the classroom. So the first is climate, having an awareness of the climate of the classroom. And what I mean by that is just being able to notice when students are confused and like taking the time to pause in the classroom and ask. Make sure to talk to your neighbor and make sure that everybody is on the same page. And this one is informed by Paul's graduate course. Their graduate math instructor would often do this. And I thought it was an interesting thing for them to note. Again, highlighting that as students, we are getting informed with how we want to teach. The other is content. So this is just typical, being well prepared in the knowledge, so you know how to answer questions, you know where students will have a pitfall, and maybe help them out of that pitfall. And other GSIs also talked about this. I'm just sort of highlighting Andy here, because I think they said it like beautifully. Other GSIs like Carlos and Longboat also talked about GSIs emphasized that being able to answer a question without a problem was a desired trait for them to have. And also having humility, being able to say, I don't know the answer to that, but I'll get back to you. And then collaboration, so the last thing, right? And this goes back to the first, how you learn math. For Carlos, this meant emphasizing to students that they should be a good classmate on top of being a good student. So not just being a good student to learn math, but also be respectful to each other. And so, as you saw before, the other GSIs emphasized that working with others is really one of the key features of learning mathematics. Okay, before I move on to RQ2, I just want to give a recap of the summaries, or the RQ1 findings, and kind of emphasize that these students have never had formal professional development in teaching, but they've had such thorough, such nuanced conversations about what it means to teach, what it means to learn math, and maybe considering their experiences as students is a good way of understanding how they begin to teach in the classroom. Like, what are they going to bring in that first day of class or that first day of orientation? All right. In terms of coloring the relationship, I kind of just want to do this through an example between Andy and Longboat, and the ways that they were framing student learning and the ways that they might respond. So for Andy, and again here I just sort of quoted the table that I had, what content practices orientations, what does this GSI do. So for them, it was kind of hard to find a statement that I could latch on to be like, oh, this is their frame of learning. But we kept coming back in the conversation about this idea of a basic skeleton. Like, once you see the skeleton, you can fill it out, you can add the organs in whatever way you want depending on the problem that you have. So for them, learning was framed as exploring all these different types of problems so that you see the underlying skeleton and then you can fill it out with whatever pieces you need. And so for them, the instructor's job and ways of responding in this sort of view of learning is that the instructor was the one helping students along the way, solving the problems, giving them scaffolded problems, going from unambiguous to slightly ambiguous to quote-unquote easy to more complicated problems. So there's this the instructor is along that journey of finding the structure and filling out the skeleton. For Longboat, they're about this research mindset. They believe that math is not given to you, it is this, you learn it through the mess of thinking about it yourself. And so what I want to highlight here is that this jumped out at me in the interview. They said they shouldn't discuss it with me. Like, if I'm giving them a problem, they can't discuss it with me. So for them, learning mathematics is again an exploration, but they're not there to help students along that exploration. They want students to explore with each other because they know the answer and they don't want to steer them too much, right? So we see these two graduate students sort of operating in the same learning frame, or frame of learning, of exploration. And it aligns nicely with Louis Adirajan and Jessup's anti-deficit way of framing mathematics learning. So I was able to say, yes, anti-deficit, right? But when we look at how they might respond in the classroom and what their desired practices are, they kind of split apart. One is about a hands-off approach. They can't ask me questions, I don't want to guide them too much, versus I'm guiding them along the way. I'm giving them the problems to do. I'm helping them see that structure, fill out that skeleton. And so this is sort of where, in discussions with my advisor, I was like, yeah, I'm finding that these two are in an anti-deficit way of framing learning, but they're kind of splitting apart after that. And so that's where the motivation of this finding is that there's this split. And so I want to get into the conclusions, and I want to spend a lot of time on this. So Louis Adirajan and Jessup laid out examples of strictly anti-deficit and strictly deficit frames and responses, but they also discussed this gray area, right? And we just saw with Longboat, they're starting off in this anti-deficit way of framing learning. And then they'll sort of they might manifest that in the classroom as being a deficit way of responding, meaning they'll let students struggle on their own, fend for themselves in the content. And so this sort of gives me pause. Because on one hand, I know that it comes from a very research mindset. They believe that mathematics is learned through messing around. You're not given math, right? But I think how students might interpret that might be in a deficit way. So I'm not one to say that something is entirely anti-deficit or entirely deficit. So it gives me this motivation to talk about a sort of gradient between deficit and anti-deficit. So even though Longboat is possibly this yellow beige line, he might not be. He might go back to anti-deficit, or maybe not so bottom deficit, but maybe just in the middle. Some students will see it as a deficit way of learning or responding, but some students might see it as an anti-deficit. And so I get this idea that, well, there's this one arrow that crosses the horizon, or the divide. So why can't I say that there's other arrows, right? So another one that I was thinking of when sort of drawing these arrows was using Louis, Adderage, and Jessup's models. Maybe they're framing learning as deficit, meaning that they're starting it off in a mathematics is an absorption of facts. It's not about exploration, you're just absorbing facts that are already given to you. But the way that they respond to students is that they allow students to decide how they want to absorb that. Maybe they want to absorb it to a lot of worksheets. Maybe they want to observe it through videos, right? So there's these two arrows that I'm sort of thinking about. And as promised, I did give you color in this framework. All right, so implications. This contributed report has barely scratched the surface, and I know that it's barely scratched the surface. This whole spectrum between deficit and anti-deficit is there. And I mainly focused on frames and responding, but there's the other two in between of attending and interpreting. And again, they're also supposed to be connected together. So if you were there in Yvonne's talk, there's a 4 choose 2 in this situation. So maybe looking at that. As for my dissertation though, I got to be in the classrooms of Paul, Carlos, and Andy. So I'm able to confirm, are their desired teaching practices actually surfacing in their classroom, and how does that compare to the models that we have? For a practical implication, I think this spectrum suggests that you don't have to entirely move somebody from deficit to anti-deficit in one professional development. Maybe there's a way for us to inch it, just bit by bit, every semester, every week, and sort of get instructors to that anti-deficit-like area. And then thinking about my dissertation again, that table that I showed you, this huge table, I should have copied it. This huge table has been updated. This is what I reported on, so this is what you're seeing, but it has been updated because I was able to talk to my participants and learn more about how frames of learning get mapped, or how frames get mapped into these contexts. So for example, one of them said, yeah, I keep in mind where this class fits into their whole coursework schedule. And yeah. So takeaways for RUME. Sorry, I'm over time. I just want you to know the two things. This is an existence proof. The graduate students have a concrete idea of what teaching and learning will be for them even before formal professional development. So maybe we can use that for professional development. And again, echoing Louis, Adderage, and Jessup's framework, the frames are consequential to deficit and anti-deficit ways of noticing, and in ways that maybe not so linear. Acknowledgements, I want to give a thank you to the graduate students that helped me make this study in the first place. And as a marginalized person in education, I also want to use this time and platform to acknowledge and honor the people killed in institutions of education destroyed in the past 100 days in Gaza and Palestine. Thank you so much.